Hi there, I'm Heather, Business Development Lead for Cooperatives First. Thanks for checking out this video. This video is a recording from our webinar that happened on November 17th, where we talked about finding win-wins, the where, the when, the why of economic development partnerships. We heard from our two expert panelists about their experience with partnerships and what they've learned along the way. I really hope you enjoyed this webinar. If you want to check out any future webinars and to sign up, just go to cooperativesfirst.com/webinars.
Welcome to the panel, Sandy and Bev. All right, so let's start things off here. I just wanted to introduce our panelists really quickly. So we have Sandy Elzinga, and she's from she's a manager of community economic development for Community Futures Boundary in BC. And we have Bev Thornton, who's the executive director of Alberta Southwest Regional Alliance. So a lot of experience with partnerships here. And so let's get right into this with a couple of questions. Okay, so first of all, I want a brief introduction to your region. So just tell us a little bit more about it, the sort of demographics, the characteristics, and kind of the area that you serve. And the reason I'd like to do this is just so that people listening can get a sense like, oh, that's actually kind of similar to my region, right? So, so give us a little bit of an introduction and then talk about how your work relies on partnerships. So I'd like, Bev, can you start us off on that question and then we'll go to Sandy after that.
Sure, I can. And thank you for inviting us here. We're always pleased to talk about our region and make people aware of what we are doing. Alberta Southwest Regional Economic Development Alliance is a partnership of 15 communities right in the very southwest corner of Alberta. So on the west, we border British Columbia, and on the south, we border on Montana, which is another topic of some really interesting transboundary relationships and partnerships just because of our geographic advantages. We are 15 communities that began collaborating in 2002. So I was looking at my notes and I'm thinking, gee, we got 20 years coming up in 2022. And a lot of things have happened over that time. We are all rural communities. Our key economic sectors are agriculture, farming and ranching, and energy, renewable energy. Of course, we're on the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains where the wind blows, but that's also created a very robust ranching operation because the wind comes in and clears off the snow so the cattle can keep growing and getting wonderful. And then, of course, tourism. We have mountains and prairies and all kinds of things for people to do. We have 3 UNESCO World Heritage Sites within an hour of each other. So there's also the culture and history of the region. Our board is made up of an elected official from each of our member communities. And I think that is something that has served to create really strong partnerships and commitment throughout the communities because they are each one-on-one engaged. I think if we think of a partnership, if you look at the legal definitions of things, a partnership is a contractual relationship where people each put something in with the expectation of getting something out. A collaboration is where people come together voluntarily to figure out something that they can address that's of a common concern. And then I think Heather can give you all kinds of details on how a cooperatives might be even slightly different or include both of those concepts. Economic development is a competitive activity, and yet we're asking these communities to come together and work to help each other work together. So that gets to be the interesting thing is where does collaboration end and then where does competition begin? And I think we've had some really interesting instances of where that continuum works to advantage or can sometimes get in the way of things. But we really, I guess, have learned over 20 years that we can help each other by sharing our best ideas. I think that's enough said. Sandy.
Earlier, Bev and I were speaking and we both agreed that we were going to keep things short and sweet. So the region that I represent is called the Boundary Region, and it's commonly known in our area as Boundary Country. And it's an area that's situated between the Okanagan and the Kootenays. So we're a very vast region. We're about 7,000 square kilometers and situated between two very steep mountain passes that prove to be quite treacherous in the winter months. So we feel quite isolated at times, I guess you might say. Our area is comprised of 7 small rural communities, and actually there are even some tiny spots that aren't even identified as communities, but little areas within communities as well. And they are very small communities for the most part. In population size, they range from about 33 residents to 7,300 residents in the city of Grand Forks and the surrounding area. I'm speaking to you from the city of Grand Forks, and that's where we do the bulk of our economic development. We do have a service through the regional district Kootenay Boundary that is very similar to what Bev is describing, in that they bring all of the communities in the Boundary Region together at a political table. From there, they actually have economic development services, and they've divided that into 3 areas because our region is vast and because there are so many differences within our region. We have Christina Lake that has economic development services, Grand Forks with economic development services, and then the entire West Boundary with economic development services. We often work together, but certainly we're also very focused on our communities, or our little piece of the pie, as you might say. Our region typically and traditionally has been supported with the forest industry, although we have a significant amount of manufacturing, agriculture, healthcare system, and tourism, all contributing to our local economy. Community Futures as an organization has been a leading organization in our region for almost 30 years. We're celebrating 30 years next year. We are one of a network of 34 Community Futures offices in British Columbia, and part of a larger network of 267 offices throughout Canada. So we have some strength in numbers, I guess you might say, and certainly in terms of the ability to draw on resources, partner, and collaborate with those organizations, and then within our own region as well. We're no stranger to partnering by any means. We're no stranger to collaborating on projects and services that support our region, and oftentimes support the greater regions. As I said, we work closely with our Community Futures counterparts as well. We rely very heavily on our Community Futures network, our local organizations, of which there are many throughout the Boundary Region, all levels of government, and we try to create grassroots solutions and facilitate economic development opportunities, and that's basically our role at Community Futures. I think the strength of our region is largely attributed to the resilient business community that we have, the strong volunteer base, and all the organizations working together. They're all really, really focused. Some of them are so focused that they focus on one specific event in a year, and others are much broader in focus. But we work closely with many of those organizations as well. This past fiscal year, we partnered with 13 different entities for community economic development projects, Regional Chamber of Commerce, Downtown Business Association, Credit Union, our city, regional district, just to name a few, as well as provincial funders as well. And we really, really appreciate the support that we get from the provincial funding level as well. How our work really, I guess, we really rely heavily on our partnerships, and I can't really say that enough. And it can be really summarized, I think, in a little quote that I saw recently. It's having the right people at the right time, doing the right things together. And we strive for partnerships. We really do strive for that. Really simply put, we can't do it all. We need our partnerships. We can't do it alone. And
Right. I
that's
think there's something that I heard in both of those, which is that both of your regions are predominantly rural. And when I hear about rural, there's almost always discussion of partnerships. And that's because of the recognition that, especially in rural areas, the partnership approach is essential to things like attracting business, getting grants. Partnership is really a must. But I did like what you brought out, Bev, about the fact that economic development is inherently competitive because each region is ultimately trying to attract things for themselves, right? So there's kind of a play there. There's sort of a dance between when it's a partnership and when it comes into an element of competition. So I think there's a lot of things in here that we can explore, but let's keep going with with some of our questions here. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about specifics because I think this is really helpful. Sometimes you could talk about something broadly, but until we have an example, it's hard to imagine what that looks like in practice. So if you could both share an example of a project or an outcome that demonstrated the value capacity gain by working as a partnership. So we're talking about really the positive, the sort of best case scenario, so positive, a partnership working in the best way possible. So what was an example of a project that really showed that, that brought it to light? So Sandy, why don't you go first on this one? Sorry, you get no break here. Just turning it around.
I think the example that I'd like to share is something that's more recent and that we're continuing to work on is our economic development service contract with the regional district. And that's specifically for the city of Grand Forks and Area D, which is our surrounding rural area. To give you a little bit of a brief history as to how we entered into this contract, we have provided economic development services for our region since 1992. So it's been really quite regional, and sometimes it's more focused on one community over another community. But in May of 2018, our community suffered a very devastating flood, and it impacted areas throughout the Boundary region, but more predominantly the downtown core of Grand Forks. And at that time, immediately following that freshet event, Community Futures went to the city and to the regional district to determine if there was some support to apply for a project under a special circumstances funding stream. And so we were supported to the tune of over $295,000 for a 2-year pilot project. And essentially that was for economic development services to develop a work plan and a strategy to help get us out of what we had just experienced as a business community. And so we worked with contractors and consultants to engage with key stakeholders in the community to gather information, develop a 3-year work plan, as well as we worked very closely with the city and the regional district and our business community too. And as you can imagine, our business community was really in turmoil during that time as well. So it was really challenging. However, we came up with a work plan and they were recommendations, and we have, it's a fluid plan. And so we've made changes along the way because, of course, once we started implementing our plan, unfortunately, COVID came along, and that also impacted, it did impact every community, really. Really, we've gained some very tangible outcomes as a result of this employment services contract. Number one, we entered into it without the thought that it was only 2 years. We entered into it, we actually signed a memo of understanding with the regional district and the city of Grand Forks to state our intention that it would be longer term. Right now, since that contract has ended and the funding has ended, we're carrying on with services supported by the regional district and the city of Grand Forks. Some tangibles that came out of that were our work plan, our investment readiness plan, a website for Invest Grand Forks, and I encourage you to take a look at our website. We're very proud of it, and it's constantly evolving. We have a lands inventory, a community profile, a series of promotional videos that were done. Some of those were done simply by Community Futures, and some of them were done with our partners at the Chamber of Commerce as well, with different focuses. We have a data investment portal on our website as well. So we really feel like we have the foundational tools to answer investment inquiries now. We act as first point of contact. So, you know, there are a lot of tangibles that came out of that. And we really feel that we've gained considerable capacity with economic development. Before it was just sort of all over the place. It was a little bit Community Futures, a little bit of, you know, contacting the city, but we sort of have some better processes and flows, and we're always working on those, of course, to answer questions quickly from investors, to really be able to, you know, give them accurate and timely information. So that's been really important to us. And the other piece of it, the final piece that I'd like to speak to is that we also formed an Economic Development Advisory Committee early on. So we have an advisory consisting of industry, of the city, of the regional district, of the Chamber of Commerce, sort of just representing our community to kind of keep us on track a little bit, I guess you might say, and also to really work with the understanding that our work plan is fluid and we adapt to the changing needs and the issues that our business community and our communities as a whole are facing. So I think those are the tangibles that we had, many partners within that project as we moved forward. So. Bev, I'll roll it over to you.
Okay. Well, very interesting stuff. I also will talk about a recent example of a project. This is one of those things that is an overnight success in 5 or 6 years, but that's kind of how these things go. One of the things I mentioned is that renewable energy is one of the key industry sectors in our region. We're considered to be the birthplace of the wind industry in Canada. The first commercial wind farm was built here in 1993. We get more hours of sunshine than almost anywhere else in Canada. So our solar industry is really growing here. So back in 2007, we formed something called the Southern Alberta Alternative Energy Partnership to help our communities understand the technology and be prepared for the opportunities that come along. So the context here is that our region does have a long time focus on renewables and the opportunities related to it. Now we fast forward to about 2014 and having a conversation with the mayor of a community in British Columbia. We share Highway 3 as a corridor across southern Alberta. And BC had just deployed an electric vehicle charging station network. And the conversation was, wouldn't it be great to be able to bring that into Southwest Alberta and just continue along Highway 3? That conversation led to some workshops and conversations with our communities and councils, which then led to the group of communities east of us saying, hey, we hear you are interested in doing this. That sounds like a good idea for us as well. So we put together a few dollars and got some expertise from the Community Energy Association just to look at what if we did this, what would it look like? What is actually the feasibility of doing a broad, fast charging electric vehicle charging station network? It was all quite promising. And suddenly one day we got a call from the city of Calgary saying, hey, we hear what you guys are doing down there. We are developing an electric vehicle strategy for the city. And we feel it would strengthen our strategy if our people in Calgary knew that they could drive all around the beautiful region. Suddenly, we had the resources of a large city endorsing what we were doing as a group of little rural communities. Government pays attention in a different way. Funders pay attention in a different way. And the whole thing just gained some credibility. So I see that as an example of the very best of rural-urban collaboration. We put our dollars together, we're able to leverage that and get some dollars from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, which is federal funding. And then we got some additional provincial funding. So we were able to let the contract, and ATCO was the successful bidder on the contract. And by 2018, we had a network of 20 fast charging and level 2 stations through connecting about 1,400 kilometers of road in southern Alberta. When we placed the installations, this was a lot of consultation with each of the 20 locations, because we didn't want it set just anywhere. Yes, we were looking at reducing greenhouse gas emissions and advocating for new technology, but really we were looking at this as a traveler amenity. It was a way to bring people into our communities. So the sites are pretty carefully placed so that there's something to do while your vehicle is plugged in. You can go for lunch, visit the gift shop, visit the museum, walk downtown, visit a park. So it becomes a traveler amenity as well as something that just advances adoption of this technology. So this actually ended up being a $2.16 million project. Stations are all networked. So the really interesting thing is that we are gathering data on the use of the site. It's giving us social trends, visitor information, as well as tracking what we're saving in greenhouse gas emissions and cost savings. So I would say that ended up being the point of that project, is that you can add partners as you need them. And the strength of it was that everybody knew what they were there to do. There was a clear goal. People knew what they were bringing to the project. And when we put it all together, it was a great success for the whole south region of the province.
I think that was actually bringing towards a point that I was considering making, Bev, so thanks for that. Before we get into our next question, because partnerships are not unlike co-ops, I suppose, as you already have pointed out for me, so thank you for that. But what I notice about a cooperative startup is that each person who's sort of gathering around the idea has to understand what the big picture vision is. Because like, sometimes there's kind of a big idea, sometimes it's not clearly articulated, sometimes it's too big or too broad and it doesn't have sort of an objective or a way to get there. And so I think a good partnership, it seems to me like what I heard in both of your examples, is that there was a common goal. There was something you needed to do, whether that was disaster recovery or adoption of alternative energy. So common goal is number one, because if you bring people together just sort of willy-nilly and then nobody knows what they're there for, what they're working towards, that's when you can run into trouble. And we're going to talk a little bit about best practices. So common goal, I saw that in both of them, and then you assemble the partners later. And the other thing I wanted to point out about both of your examples, not necessarily related, but it's really impressive to me, is that you both adopted, in the rollout of the initiative itself, you both adopted such a client or customer-centric viewpoint. You looked at the person who was using the service. You didn't think about like, okay, how does this benefit us? It's like, okay, what does the traveler want? All right, so what is the visitor or what is the investor? Like, how do they journey through our services? How do they experience it? It's looking at their experience instead of considering it from your side. And I think that's just general best practices when you're starting any initiative. And I just thought, kudos to both of you for thinking in that way and to those initiatives. Okay, so the last question here. We'll start with Bev and then go to Santi on this one. So just if you can speak about your best advice and experience about the why of partnerships and the best practices that make collaboration work. We've already been talking about them, but what's your best tips? What's your takeaway for people who are attending, who are looking into getting into more partnerships? How do you make it work? Bev, go ahead.
Well, I guess the first thing off, we get things done with people that we like and respect, have fun with. So whatever you're doing, if you can get to know your people, build relationships with them, and try to have some fun. If you're not having fun, why bother? It's also important to be organized and communicate clear expectations. In our case, we have monthly board meetings. They are at a regular time. There gets to be a routine to the communication and the collaboration, and it's regular. So people build relationships and get to know each other. So simply setting the stage or the context for people to get to know each other. Another thing we do at our meetings is we have a round table where it isn't just come to the meeting, make the decisions and go home. There's time spent to update what's happening in your community. What challenges are you facing? What successes have you had? And when you've got 15 communities, this is a really good way for everyone to get a sense of what's happening in the region. And it does lead to identifying some of those common goals and issues. To what you said, Heather, we try to encourage people to think not just what's in it for me, but what can I bring to the table? So you have a community saying, why are we paying money to belong to this? What are we getting out of it? Well, we try to exhibit the return on investment for our members, but we also get them thinking, what can you contribute that is going to be helpful to everyone else? And that puts a different slant on things. We've also learned that what gets measured gets managed. Alberta Southwest over its life has probably achieved at least 30 different provincial, national, and international awards. And that isn't really for the sake of just having some trophies and plaques on the wall of our office. It is really a way to see what are we doing and how do we measure up against what other people are doing. And it does force us to, not force us, it helps us see what we're doing that's right. And it helps us see where we can find some new ideas to accomplish some things better. And we're a small organization with a small budget. And I think what we always try to do is to keep our projects aligned with the resources that we have. And I think probably most of us with our organizations, our ideas exceed the resources that we have to do them. So we are quite careful about what we choose to do with our time and money so that it builds on what we've accomplished before. And it helps the communities build capacity by working with each other. I think of it as Olympic athletes that train together. We all are trying to build the capacity and make each of our communities the best that they can be, and then respect their right and their responsibility to use those skills and capacity to pursue their own goals for their own community. I think that's
Great,
it.
Andy. That's great. That's perfect.
I'm going to try not to be too repetitive, and I'm maybe going to just jump off from where Bev spoke about projects aligning with the resources that you do have. I also think sort of tagging onto that a little bit is that the projects align with the resources that you have, but also align with the mandate for your organization as well. Because I think that it's very, very easy. I know Community Futures covers so many things. We're involved in so many programs and services. It's very easy to lose sight of really what your mandate for your organization is, and really where your focus areas are. So we've really kind of honed that in and saying, these are the services that we offer. First and foremost, we are a lending and financial institution for businesses. Secondly, we provide employment services, and third, we provide economic development. And we try to kind of, align what our projects are going to be for that, because otherwise you get too scattered and you can't do what it is that you want to do. You can't do many things well. So we try to kind of focus. But in terms of best practices that make collaborations work, and Bev, you hit on many of the points that I sort of jotted down quickly in brief form, so I'll try not to duplicate any of those. I think being flexible and also, you want to see your vision. You don't want to lose sight of what your vision is, but be flexible and adaptable. We certainly found that with our economic development service contract, that we needed to adapt. We had certain projects and activities that we wanted to do. COVID came along, we needed to adapt. So always be flexible and fluid, but don't lose sight of that bigger picture, your goal that you really want to ultimately have. I think other practices are really assess the risk factors involved in a project. Bev, you sort of talked about that a little bit and touched on that with your project that you gave an example of, but there are risk factors, and they're financial, they're legal risk factors, they're even risk factors in terms of capacity to deliver, and what if one certain individual leaves and they're not there to kind of fill that role. So that's a big piece of it. Be clear about the level of involvement with your partners and the contribution that you need to have from them. What does that look like? It's okay, I can probably knock on 20 doors tomorrow and say, hey, would you partner in this? And they'd say yes, and not even ask a question. But I think it's really important to share that information. This is our expectation. This is how much time it will take, even if they're participating, say, as an advisory member. What's that look like? How many meetings per year is that going to look like? How much time is that going to involve? Are there extra activities around that? Be clear on who's the champion or the lead and what their roles and responsibilities are. Transparency. And that's not only with the partners involved, but it's also with the community as a whole as well. Inform the community of what it is that you're doing and how you're doing it and who you're partnering with. I think that's really important, and you can convey that message in many ways. It can be social media, it can be advertising, it can be through presentations, but just try to communicate as much as you can. And that's one of the biggest challenges we always have. It's we're busy trying to do the day-to-day stuff, and how do you communicate what it is you're doing, and how do you celebrate those successes? Not only just, at the end of a project, but along the way, and who do you include in those celebrations? So I think those are really important pieces. Also recognizing that each organization that's involved in a partnership often has they have a different focus, right? So you need to be really respectful of that and understand that, this is why we're coming together, and, understand why they're kind of bringing their pieces to the puzzle, and just be, aware of and respectful of that level of autonomy that they need to have as an organization as well. Partnerships can be delicate. We need to recognize that too. We need to know how to finesse that, and who finesses it, and how that gets massaged, because I think that they can be delicate. Sometimes it's even having in-house some type of a conflict resolution process to go through should there be conflict. We don't run into that at that level, but I think it's just something to be aware of. And I think
what we should, sorry, Sandy, to cut you off. I think what we should do is, we've got a couple more minutes, so I think I'd like to break into discussion groups, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,